Hi, chess fans. Welcome back. Today is the 50th anniversary of Bobby Fischer winning the World Championship. He won it in this game we're going to show here, Game 21. I was 16 years old that November, so I was 15 when this was played. How it's 50 years ago is, that's another story. But it was an amazing time. Now, I played chess a little bit. I liked the game when I was a kid. I ended up playing on the high school team up here in upstate New York in Binghamton. And we formed the Southern Tier Scholastic Chess League. That's long since folded. I tried to revive the league, but school administrators, he's like talking to the wall. It doesn't cost them anything, but they still won't do it. But anyway, make a long story short, I got my love for the game. It's the greatest game in the world. It's beautiful. It's like poetry almost. Anybody that plays knows that it's beautiful. There's a line in the miniseries The Queen's Gambit on Netflix. I don't normally promote Netflix shows. It's based on a famous book in the 1970s, The Queen's Gambit, about a young girl prodigy in chess. It's amazingly well done. And as she's being interviewed, the interviewer said, well, it's still about winning and losing in the end. She goes, well, not always. She goes, what do you mean? Sometimes it's just beautiful. And it is. It's a beautiful game. And this is the game that Fischer won to get himself the world championship. I remember distinctly. It was all over every newspaper. Of course, we only had the three networks back then, ABC, NBC, and CBS. I mean, it's right in the middle of Watergate. Top story today is Fischer in Reykjavik, Iceland. It was on the top half of the fold at every major newspaper in the world. Every single day. It was one of the most astounding things I've ever seen as far as culture goes. It was the Russia versus United States Cold War. And it was the heat of the Cold War, 1972. So rather than keep talking here, let's go through the game. Spassky is white and Fischer is black. And we're going to go through. It's a Sicilian. Knight takes A6. I forget what variation is. Tamanov, I think it is. Knight C3. Pretty much standard stuff. Got to remember back then, chess theory, especially for openings, was much less than it is now with the supercomputers. Knight F6. Bishop D3, D5, Fischer going right after the center. E takes, white castles. Fischer develops his king bishop. Knight takes, pawn takes. Bishop D4, interesting move there. And that's also the move of the computer. Not by much. Queen D2 is also liked by the computer as well. Castles. Now, here's an unusual move. It's not even listed on one of the three choices for the computer. The computer likes knight to A4, which is interesting because I think what he's looking at is knight going to this square would be tough. You'd have to get rid of the knight with the bishop, and you don't want to trade. You want to keep the bishop pair. Goes queen to F3. Queen to F3. Now, that might be old school theory. Remember, this is 1972. Fischer plays bishop B6. Spassky develops his rook. C5. He goes right after the bishop. So he decides, okay, instead of backing the bishop up, I can't. Because if I move him here, this pawn comes up and forks them both. You don't want that. So, bishop takes, queen takes. Now, you could take with a g-pawn. You could take with a g-pawn, but here's the problem. Now your king is open with this white queen on the board, and you don't want that. So you take with a queen, queen takes, g takes. Now, the exposure of black's king is not a big deal now because the queens are off the board. It makes the danger for the king much, much less. Now, you say to yourself, look at this position. Fischer's pawns are a mess. He's got 4 pawn islands, and one's doubled, 2 are isolated, but he's got that bishop pair. I'm telling you, it shows a small advantage, not much of one for black, but I think the advantage is a lot more than the computer shows, which is about 1/4 of a pawn. I think Fischer's got a good position. Those 2 bishops are going to rake holy hell. Rook, bishop b2. We're just maneuvering the rooks around. Spassky moves his pawn. c4. That's a big deal. He's trying to go after the pawn, disrupt the queen side to get his rook in. And Spassky decides to take knight takes d5. Now, that is also the computer's move. Interesting enough, though, rook take d5 is right a second. Because you end up the same anyway, as you'll see no matter which one you take with. Knight takes, bishop takes. Interesting enough, though, might have been bishop check first. And then king, rook takes, bishop takes, king takes, rook e8. That might have been interesting. But that rook is stuck there. After bishop takes d5, king takes, rook takes, and there we go. He takes the pawn. Rook goes back to d2. Now he's threatening both of these pawns, the c pawn and white's f pawn. He needs to get some pawns off the board. Now the computer shows a small advantage for black, but I like black a lot better. It's a lot easier to play. Bishop takes, rook takes. You could have went the other way. You could have taken the f pawn. But here's the problem. These pawns you're going to get a tempo. These pawns are going to start coming up. So Fischer made the right decision by taking the c pawn. Rook d2. I mean, look at what's going to happen here. If he doesn't block with the rook, Fischer's either going to win the a pawn or the f pawn. So he has to get rid of one of the rooks. So he decides to go rook e2, and they trade. Rook to d8. Great move. Great move. You're threatening here when you're going to go in both directions. You've got to do something. a4. Now, if Fischer comes down with his rook, this bishop can come here, and all 3 of these are protecting each other. Rook to d2 anyway. He goes to c4. And rook a2. Now, he's just trying to keep all those pieces from moving. And none of them can move. None of the pawns can move. You move the a pawn, rook takes. You move the b pawn, rook takes the a pawn. So that rook is tying down everything. So what else do you have to deal with? Your kings. And here come the kings. Now, those of you in the endgame that know that play, kings are a very powerful piece. They're a fighting piece in the endgame, but not in the middle or the beginning of the game. There's too much power on the board, especially the queens. But now the kings come out. Fischer does a move here, which is interesting. It's also the computer's move. Let's see if we can pause the video and find it. I thought it was fascinating. Most of us would probably bring the king around, you know, like this. Bring the king around. Nope, there's a better move than that. Pause the video and find it, and that's f5. Now, what's white going to do? He almost has to take. If he goes g5, then you go f6. So he takes. And then Fischer pushes the pawn up. Did you notice something? Light squared bishop, pawn on a dark square, which means that bishop can never, ever attack it. So he goes after that pawn, h6. Technically, it's even in material. A bishop and 2 pawns for a rook, which is 5 and 5. But Fischer's position is by far superior. The computer gives it less than a pawn advantage for black, but I don't buy it. This is really hard to play for black. g3. King d6. Now, here's where I think these little subtleties in the endgame, It's really complicated. What do you do here? What do you do as white? You move the king up. Well, you can't move the king away from the F-pawn or you lose the F-pawn. So what do? He goes king F3. Actually, I thought that this move was better. It keeps the king from coming in, the black king, because now all these squares are guarded. But that's not what happened. But he didn't do that. He played king to F3. So Fischer went rook A1. Beautiful move. What that does is it threatens this. And that rook cuts off the white king from stopping the pawn from marching and becoming another queen. Spassky, seeing that, moved the king back to G2, which they call lose a tempo. Those who don't play means you basically waste a move. So he gave Fischer an extra move, in essence. King E5. Bishop's got to come back to protect. Here comes the king. Bishop goes to D7. Rook to B1, threatening the pawn. He moves the bishop back. Rook to B2, stopping the movement of the F-pawn because it'll be in check. Bishop C4. Now, you can go over this yourself. If Fischer had taken this pawn would have advanced. He would have came over. Pawn would have went up threatening with the bishop, and the pawns would have marched down the board. And Fischer, of course, he knew all that. And he went back rook to A2, bishop B6, and then H5. Here comes the black pawn. Now, this is move 40. Back in the old days, they used to play the 40th move, and the 41st move, you sealed in an envelope, and you played out the game the next day. They don't do that anymore, thank God. It's a big pain in the behind. So Boris Spassky sealed his 41st move, which was bishop D7. So he can say, as world champion, that was the last move I ever made as world champion. And that's tough. So the next morning, that night, they're probably analyzing it, him and his people, and they realized the game was lost. So we called Bobby Fischer's people and said, you have a new world champion. I want to congratulate Bobby. And a couple hours later, it was official, and Bobby Fischer became the world chess champion, his lifelong dream. And I was so excited. I was only 15 years old. I remember I was so excited. It was huge. Every newspaper and television, every single night. Fischer-Spassky, Fischer-Spassky. It was a Cold War thing. Russia versus United States. And it was one of the biggest sporting events that ever. I mean, there were bars in New York that instead of showing the ball game, remember, this is August. They're in bars in New York, and all the TVs had the Fischer-Spassky chess match on in New York. Chess exploded in the United States, and unfortunately, Fischer suffered a major mental breakdown and did some bad things, and I don't blame him for that any more than I blame somebody that has MS or cancer. You don't ask for that. But that's the way it went. And it was an amazing time, especially if you love chess. And here we are 50 years later, and I still love it. And I'm going to be playing in the New York State Championship. I live in upstate New York. I'll be playing this weekend. I can't say my game has improved in 50 years that much, but I like to think so. But I still love the game. It's great for seniors. It's great for children. It's great for everybody. It's such a beautiful game. And I'll always thank Fischer for getting that joy and love of chess. And so there you are, 50 years later. Hard to believe. The game that Bobby Fischer won to become world champion. Until the next game, folks, goodbye and good luck.